Hi, Sarah here from Norton Mental Health. Today I'm thrilled to have with me Norton author Lindsey Biel. She is the author of Sensory Processing Challenges, Effective Clinical Work with Kids and Teens. And today we're going to talk about sensory processing disorder. You may remember Lindsey from her previous book, Raising a Sensory Smart Child, which she co-authored with Nancy Pesky in 2005. In that book, there's a foreword by Grandin, and on this book, there's a blurb right on the cover by Grandin. Lindsey is a pediatric occupational therapist in private practice in New York. She is co-creator of Sensory Processing Masterclass DVD series, and she presents regularly at workshops for parents and professionals. Thank you for joining me today,
Thank
Lindsey.
you, Sarah, for having me.
Give us a brief overview of sensory processing disorder.
Sure. We all learn about the world through our senses. We move through space, we touch things, we smell things, we see things, we hear things. And sensory processing is how we take all these bits of sensory input and transform it into meaningful information that we can use to have an accurate, reliable picture of the environment and our place in it. Mm-hmm. So we know how to behave and what to do. And it's a process that happens automatically for most of us. Some people are wired differently neurologically, so they don't take in and use sensory input in quite the same way. A person can be hypersensitive to sensory input so that everything comes in too intensely, too loudly. For example, a child walking into a crowded classroom may feel like he's walking into a rock and roll concert with all the noise of people talking, and sometimes there's background music playing in a classroom, there are bright lights, there's so much to look at and so much to hear and see and manage that it can be very overwhelming for a hypersensitive person. The person who's hypersensitive to input will understandably try to avoid becoming overwhelmed, overstimulated. As a young child, they just do get overstimulated, and as we mature, we learn how to manage the sensory experiences so that we don't become so uncomfortably overstimulated. So the older child, teenager or adult with hypersensitivity will rigidly control how much input they deal with, or just avoid situations that will tend to be overstimulating altogether. Mm-hmm. So that's the hypersensitive person. Some of us are hypo or undersensitive, and the person who's like that is kind of sluggish and low arousal. It may take a lot of very stimulating input for that person to really attend and focus and tune in. Often you might have a child who's kind of tuned out until you put on a fast-paced, colorful video or a video game, and then the person tunes in. And then there are those kids who are crave input and are constantly seeking it out. We call them sensory seekers, sensory cravers.
So this must lead to a lot of behavioral signs that clinicians and parents see every day. Can you point to some of those common ones?
Absolutely. A child who is really struggling with sensory processing difficulties will, you need to cope somehow. And typically the person dealing with strong sensitivities will either act up or tune out. So we see some of those related behaviors. Acting up might be, hitting classmates who come too close, refusing to engage in cleanup time, refusing to follow along with classroom routines. Mm-hmm. The tuned out child may have learning difficulties because there's so much at the mercy of what they're experiencing from a sensory standpoint that they're not available for learning.
And so you brought some toys here, it looks like. What are they? Can you go over them?
Sure. Once you know what's going on with a person, mm-hmm. you need to, on the one hand, you're going to build the skills, but you also need to do some compensation so the person feels better right away.
Right.
So I brought a couple of things that I love to use with people. Sure. for kids, teens, and adults with low muscle tone who have trouble sitting still, and they go into this low arousal state when they're sitting on a chair for long periods, kind of like we all feel during a long, boring meeting. It's very hard. They start falling down into their chair. So I'll often give them an inflatable seat cushion to sit under. Would you like to try it?
I would love
It's
to.
got a bumpy
yeah.
side or a smooth side. Which one would you like to try?
I'll try the bumpy. Why not?
Okay, so you're going to put
Just
the
like
wine.
this?
Yeah, and see
Alright.
what happens. Go ahead and sit on it.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of activates your postural muscles.
Yeah, my abs and that sort of thing, and you
Right.
have to work to
And
kind of
kids
stay.
who are really bouncy
right.
can do that bouncing
Uh-huh.
on that seat cushion, but
Right.
still stay seated.
No, this is definitely nice. I'd like this in the office.
Yeah, kids love that. Kids love that. All right, a couple of
Great.
other fun things. Kids who are kind of nervous and or edgy or anxious and always like touching things and rubbing things and biting on their clothing. I have a
Right.
lot of fun things for that. Sometimes just giving a hand fidget
Mm-hmm.
can help, and I'll show you a couple of cute ones. Just rolling something like this.
Okay.
Also really good and desensitizing for the inside of the hand.
Yeah.
And again, these are compensations. It's not fixing the problem, but it's
Right.
giving the person a tool that can help them feel better.
Mm-hmm.
I love the Tangle Junior.
Oh, I
hand
have one of
fidget.
those.
Do you?
Actually, I do.
Okay, I love that.
I got it as a gift.
Okay. Yeah, those are
That's awesome,
great
yeah.
things. For the person who's constantly chewing on their clothing or biting their nails or just having oral issues,
Right.
I like to give an oral comfort item like chewing gum.
Mhm.
If the person's on a gluten-free diet, they can chew Glee gum, which is gluten-free. Also like oral comfort items like this can clip onto clothing. A child could just chew on it
Oh,
if
wow,
they
okay.
need it. It's more hygienic. Do I want someone to be chewing on a thing? Not especially, but it's more hygienic than chewing on a hand
Mhm.
or another child or
Right, yeah.
something like that.
And so I want to touch upon this because in your book, in chapter 3, you say that sensory processing disorder is often associated with other disorders. Could you elaborate on this statement? Not everyone who has sensory processing disorder is autistic, while those who have autism are more likely to have sensory processing disorder.
Right. 9 out of 10 people on the autistic spectrum do have sensory processing challenges.
Mhm.
Sometimes the most extreme and disabling ones. A fluorescent light might feel like a thunderstorm because a sensitive person, especially on the spectrum, can see and hear that fluorescent light turn on and off. Certain sounds can feel like a dentist drill hitting a nerve. So it's really, it's very extreme in autism.
Yeah.
And when those sensory issues are pinpointed and addressed successfully, the autism itself becomes much easier to manage. Now, there are many people with sensory problems who don't meet any criterion for autism.
Okay.
So there are people who are diagnosed with attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, anxiety, learning issues, even giftedness, who have sensory problems that occur comorbidly.
Mhm.
There are also people who do not qualify for any diagnosis whatsoever aside from sensory processing disorder.
Uh-huh.
So it can be a standalone disorder.
Right.
This is why it's so important to understand the sensory problems so it can help with a differential diagnosis.
Right, and so that leads me, there's a debate going on now about how the DSM-V actually left out sensory processing disorder as a disorder. So the debate is sensory processing disorder a disorder? And so from your work as a pediatric occupational therapist, what do you have to say about this debate?
Well, a couple of things. We know that the new edition of the DSM had several changes that not everybody is in agreement on. There are
Right.
some things that some of us find very unfortunate that were put in the DSM or taken out more accurately, particularly in regards to autism. The good news is that hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity were added as diagnostic criteria for autism. So that's a good thing, but it doesn't do much for the people who are not autistic. It's still, they're still having these issues. First, I want to say that sensory processing problems have been in the diagnostic manuals and are still since 2006, so just not the DSM.
Oh, I see, okay.
It's in the 0 to 3 manual for early childhood, as well as Stanley Greenspan and Serena Whiter's diagnostic manual. So it's been out there for a while. It's recognized. It just hasn't been recognized in the DSM. It was considered for inclusion for quite some time. And it went back and forth and back and forth, and we really had quite a bit of hope that it would make it. Part of why it was excluded was that there was not enough scientific evidence showing that it's a distinct disorder. Since then, there have been a couple of indisputable studies about that differentiate between people with autism and SPD and ADHD that show that there are neuroanatomical differences in how the body works, and I find those very intriguing. People with sensory issues alone have different parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system function than people with autism, and they've parsed those out and separated those out. They're also finding there are differences in nervous system function with between people with sensory issues and ADHD. So sometimes they're comorbid, sometimes they're not. And there was a very intriguing new study that took a look at the white matter in the back of the brain, and it showed that there are differences, structural differences in the nerve tracts that are responsible for multisensory integration in people with sensory challenges and no concurrent diagnoses. So they're starting to separate it out.
Do you feel that people are becoming more aware of sensory processing disorder? And also, what steps do you think need to be taken so that people become more knowledgeable about this and how it affects children's behavior?
I do think that people are becoming much more aware of sensory processing challenges. Parents have always been aware of their child's sensory quirks, but oftentimes what looks like bad behavior has an underlying sensory challenge, and it's been a process for more and more parents to really learn the difference between sensory and behavior. Actually, that's a trick question because they're intertwined. Pediatricians are learning about it more, classroom teachers. Some really good things have been happening after SPD was excluded from the DSM. Pediatrics magazine came out with a statement saying there's this thing, sensory processing disorder. It's like this, you know, they sort of described it and said, don't use it as a standalone disorder.
Okay.
And I was kind of thrilled about that because it means that now all pediatricians are like, what's sensory processing disorder?
It brings attention to it, exactly.
It totally brought attention to it, so it was wonderful to me. I've been interviewed by Parents Magazine and a number of, mainstream consumer magazines. I've also been interviewed by Child Mind Institute's wonderful online blog and a number of different groups, and that has brought a lot of attention to the forefront. There's just Lucy Jane Miller out in Colorado has been in the press quite a bit, and I'm hoping that my book will further that understanding of sensory processing challenges.
Oh, well, wonderful. And actually, in your previous book, so Raising a Sensory Smart Child, that was geared more toward parents, whereas this one is talks more to clinicians.
Yes.
So what advice can you give clinicians on developing a therapeutic program that works?
Okay, so the first thing to do is understand what's going on from a client's perspective. And in the book, I give kind of a framework for doing that. I have sensory screening tools in the book, one for home use and one for school use. And I think that's really helpful for a clinician to use as a tool for screening kids, teens, and even some adult clients to understand what's happening from a sensory standpoint. There's also a sensory challenge questionnaire that can be filled out with a client, or by a client, depending on how old and how, where the person's at. So that's the first step, is finding out what is that person's sensory experience like. A clinician may be the first person ever to ask if fluorescent lights bother the person. And that can be a revelation. No one ever asked me when I was a kid. I understand sensory problems because we all have little sensory quirks, sensory things that bother us. For me, it's fluorescent lights. I can see them, I can hear them.
Oh no.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I've gotten very good at tuning them out.
Right.
Therefore, I don't have a disorder.
Uh-huh.
But it's really empowering for when I ask one of my clients, what's going on at school? What do you like the lights? Do you like the Play-Doh? What does the Play-Doh smell like to you? What is the And we sort of go through the different routines that they experience each day. It's very empowering for a child to feel understood. We know that's the first step in making changes, to feel understood, and for clinicians to really get a good, clear picture of what's happening with their client. And then you can start to implement some what I call sensory smart strategies, and like practical solutions, things that can help the person to feel better. Mental health clinicians play such a key role in helping clients with sensory processing problems, particularly in terms of developing insight and making plans to proactively manage sensory sensitivities. But they can't do it all. It's really important to remember that it takes a village to help people with sensory problems. I strongly suggest that clinicians work with an occupational therapist who has advanced training and knowledge in this subspecialty of occupational therapy. And an OT will evaluate I've included screening tools. It's not evaluation tools here.
Right.
A real sensory evaluation includes these general questions that help to flesh out a picture of what the person's sensory world is like. But it also looks at things like neuromuscular status, muscle tone, what is the person's ability to integrate vestibular movement input with visual input. So we're looking for the integration of senses. We need to figure out where that's breaking down, if it's breaking down. We need to look at touch localization, touch discrimination, to find out where there's a problem. And working together with the ideal team is a mental health clinician and an occupational therapist who can work together.
How did you become interested in occupational therapy?
I first worked as a writer for many years.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Cool.
And then as it became time for a second career, I thought, well, maybe I'll become a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I even thought about. But then I came across occupational therapy, which it ended up that I was a volunteer in what I now realize was an occupational therapy department in a nursing home back in high school.
Oh, wow.
And I just sort of came around full circle to occupational therapy. And it's funny, I had to quit being a full-time writer in order to write 2 books now. So I just thought it was the perfect field because it works with all different ages, age groups, and with such a variety of issues. And then I got interested in sensory processing disorder because I work with so many different kinds of kids with autism, developmental delays, physical disabilities, learning disabilities. And I became aware that basically each one of them had a foundation of sensory processing that was a little bit shaky. And I had to sort of go step back before I could work on, let's say, handwriting, which is an end product. Go back and work on those foundational skills, those body awareness skills,
Right.
neuromuscular skills, eye-hand coordination skills, and then work on sensory processing.
Right. So to see improvement just from working on the basics, the foundations must have been amazing.
Oh,
right?
it's pretty incredible. You still need to teach the higher level skills,
Right.
but it's like if the first floor of the house isn't solidly built, the attic's not going to be too steady.
Exactly. And so for our viewers, do you have any events and workshops coming up that they should know about?
I do. I'm speaking at the YAI International Conference at the end of this month in New York City. I'm speaking at the Yale Child Study Center in June, and I'm always scheduling workshops, and people can find where I'm speaking next on the Sensory Smarts website. That's SENSORYSMARTS.com.
Okay, great.